You stand in the deep quiet of a Lyon street, still entirely dark. The cobblestones damp with night mist that clings to every stone without reflecting the faintest glimmer. The air is cool and still, carrying the distant, muted scent of the Saône River and the dry mineral smell of old stone walls. Before you was a modest stone building, its facade plain and unadorned, the heavy wooden door closed and fitted snug into its frame. Beneath that door, a thin sliver of amber light seeps out, the only sign that the workshop inside holds any life at all, lying across the threshold like a single thread of gold resting on dark wool. Inside the workshop, in near silence, a single candle burns on a work table positioned at the center of the room. The flame rises steady and low from a short stub of beeswax, its tip a small teardrop of blue nestled at the base of the wick, while melted wax pools clear and warm around the stub, slowly hardening at the edges into a delicate rim. Overhead, the wooden beams run across the ceiling, darkened by years of candle smoke, catching the upward glow and returning it as a soft, diffuse light that barely reaches the corners. High, narrow windows, each set with small panes of uneven glass, still hold the complete blackness of night, showing nothing of the sky or the street, only a deep, still darkness pressed against the panes like a patient observer. The air inside the workshop carries several scents layered together without hurry, the beeswax of the candle mingling with the faint oiled fragrance of old wood from the floorboards and the table, along with the raw, slightly grassy smell of silk filament stored in open trays, and beneath it all, a cold metallic tang coming from small cedar boxes that hold squares of gold leaf. The room waits with the stillness of a place accustomed to long, repetitive work, every object positioned exactly where it will be needed, and nothing moves except the candle flame itself, which bends very slightly each time a draught sneaks under the door, causing the shadows on the wooden beams to shift as softly as the rise and fall of a sleeper's breath. Near the wall opposite the door, the spinning wheel stands motionless, its large wooden drive wheel rising almost to waist height, the rim polished smooth by countless hours of motion, the turned spokes radiating from the hub with an even, balanced grace. The drive band, a thin strip of leather, loops around the wheel and the small spindle pulley, holding just enough tension to transmit power the moment the treadle is pressed, but now it rests slack and silent, waiting without any sign of impatience. On the floor beside the wheel a low stool sits, its seat worn into a shallow hollow that perfectly fits the spinner who will occupy it, the wood darkened and smoothed to a soft sheen by years of daily use. A second, smaller stool stands nearby, empty and equally still, its only purpose to hold a shallow wooden tray where spools of raw silk filament lie in neat parallel rows, each spool a compact cylinder of pale cream fiber that catches the candlelight with a subdued gleam. On the work table itself, the candle stands at one corner, and the rest of the surface is covered with a clean linen cloth that hangs over the edges in gentle folds, its whiteness turned amber by the candle glow. At the center of this cloth rests a small leather pad, about the size of an open hand, its surface darkened with use and bearing the faint traces of gold dust pressed into the grain over many months, and next to it lies a fine camel hair brush with a handle of polished bone, its bristles soft and pointing toward the leather pad as if ready to lift something delicate. A flat wooden spatula, with a tip worn to a gentle bevel, is placed beside the brush, and a little copper bowl filled with a shallow depth of clean water sits nearby, the water so still that it mirrors the candle flame perfectly upside down, a tiny inverted teardrop of light, trembling only when the table receives a vibration too faint to notice. Further back on the table, a row of small cedar boxes is arranged in a straight line, each box closed with a snug-fitting lid, the wood pale and fragrant even from a distance, its scent a clean, sharp note that cuts through the heavier beeswax and silk smells. Inside those boxes the gold leaf waits, each square separated by a slip of tissue paper, beaten so thin that if you were to lift one now in the candlelight, it would glow as brightly as the flame itself. Gossamer sheets of metal that quiver at the passage of a breath and cling to anything they touch. Beside the boxes, a small leather pouch holds the day's supply of gold leaf ready for immediate use, its drawstring pulled tight, the pouch resting on its side with the soft crumple of thin metallic squares barely audible if one listened close. The silk filament that will become the core of the precious thread lies in a shallow wooden tray to the left of the work table, bundles of raw silk drawn from cocoons and loosely twisted, their color a pale cream that seems almost white in the candlelight. The filaments are fine and strong, and they lie in loose coils that overlap one another without tangling, each coil held in place by the gentle weight of its neighbor. A length of single filament has already been drawn out and stretched between two small guide pegs set into the tabletop, its path a straight line of faint shimmer that cuts across the linen cloth like a strand of spider silk caught by morning dew, though here there is no dew, only the dry, worn stillness of the indoor night. The floor of the workshop is made of wide planks that creak softly when stepped on, but now no footfalls disturb them, and each plank has settled into its position so completely that not even a sigh of expansion or contraction can be heard. A few stray fibers of silk lie on the boards near the work table, glinting when the candlelight catches them at the right angle, and a small basket beneath the table holds scraps of linen and snippets of thread from previous days, all resting in a dark pool of shadow that moves only when the candle flame sways. The walls are of plaster over stone, whitewashed long ago to a soft ivory color, and here and there a faint crack runs from floor to ceiling like a slow river on a map, widening slightly where the building has settled over the centuries, but not enough to admit any draught. The silence in the workshop is not a complete absence of sound, but a deep layered quiet, composed of many tiny, almost inaudible noises that together create a feeling of profound peace. The candle wick gives off a faint whisper as it burns, a sound so close to silence that it only becomes noticeable if you hold your breath and listen with all your attention. The oiled wood of the spinning wheel occasionally emits a tiny click as the temperature adjusts a fraction of a degree, a sound like a pebble dropping into a very distant pond. Outside the high windows, the city of Lyon sleeps under the same darkness, and beyond the stone walls the street lies empty of carts and pedestrians, the only movement being the slow drift of mist along the cobblestones and the occasional drip of moisture from a roof tile into the gutter below. Even the river Saône, a few streets away, contributes only a low, constant murmur that travels through the ground rather than the air, a sound felt more than heard, like the slow breathing of the land itself. The candle flame continues its steady burn, and now, after a long stretch of absolute stillness, a very distant sound enters the workshop, so faint that at first it seems like a memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. It is the muffled crow of a rooster, coming from some courtyard far across the network of Lyon streets, its call traveling through layers of stone and timber before arriving as little more than a soft pulse in the air, a reminder that the night has begun its slow turn toward dawn, even if the sky shows no sign of it yet. The call does not disturb the stillness, but instead becomes part of it, absorbed into the quiet, like a single note struck once on a muted string and allowed to fade without echo. After it passes, the silence returns deeper than before, as if the sound has swept away the last residue of alertness from the night and left only pure rest behind. The objects in the room remain undisturbed, the spinning wheel patient, the bobbins ready, the gold leaf sealed in cedar, the silk stretched in its straight line. Time passes in the workshop, not as a sequence of minutes, but as a slow accumulation of stillness, each moment identical to the last, and nothing marks its passage except the gradual shortening of the candle, the wax pull growing slightly wider, the wick darkening at its tip. The high windows still hold blackness, though the quality of that blackness has changed from the dense opacity of midnight to a slightly softer dark that holds the first, entirely imperceptible promise of grey light somewhere beyond the rooftops. Then, after what might have been a quarter of an hour or a full hour, a new sound reaches the workshop, closer this time and more distinct, the soft metallic scrape and click of a key turning slowly in the lock of the heavy wooden door. The sound is gentle, unhurried, as if the person on the other side also respects the deep quiet and wishes to enter without breaking it. The key pauses for a moment at the full turn, then withdraws with another soft click, leaving the door still closed, but now unlocked, and the candle flame, as if acknowledging the change, dips once and then straightens, its light steadying as the workshop waits to receive the spinner, who will soon step inside. You are seated on a low bench in the corner of the workshop, the wood smooth and cool beneath you, your back resting against the whitewashed wall where the plaster has been worn to a soft polish. by the shoulders of countless quiet observers before you. The candle flame on the work table still burns with the same steady, small light, and the heavy wooden door remains closed. You know the key has already turned, and the lock is open. A long pause hangs in the air, a silence so complete that you can hear the faint settling of your own weight on the bench, and then the door swings inward with a slow, oiled motion that makes no sound beyond the soft breath of air moving across the threshold. A figure steps inside, carrying the sharp coolness of the pre-dawn street on the folds of a dark woolen cloak, and you watch as the door closes behind, with a soft, padded thud that seals the workshop away from the outside world once more. The person moves with a practiced slowness, every gesture unhurried and certain, a familiarity with this space so deep that the body finds its way without a moment of searching. You see the wool cloak lifted from the shoulders and carried to a wooden peg set into the wall near the door, where it is hung with care, the hood folded back and the hem straightened so that no damp cloth touches the floor. Beneath the cloak, the spinner wears simple working clothes of undyed linen and wool, the sleeves rolled just above the wrists, the fabric soft from many washings and holding the faint, clean scent of lavender and wood ash. The first task after hanging the cloak is to bring more light into the room, and you watch as the spinner crosses to the work table, the floorboards making only the slightest creak under the light, deliberate steps. From a small drawer in the table she takes 2 fresh candles, each a slender taper of beeswax, and she holds the wick of the first to the existing flame until it catches with a tiny flare that steadies into a small bright point. This new candle is set into a brass holder at the far end of the work table, where its light falls upon the row of cedar boxes and the leather pouch with a gentle wash of gold. The second candle is lit from the first and placed in a holder on a shelf near the spinning wheel, so that the great wheel now casts 2 faint shadows instead of 1, the double penumbras overlapping on the floor like the slow fan of a grey wing. The original candle stub, now much shorter and pooled in a wide ring of solidified wax, is left to burn on, and the workshop fills with the combined glow of 3 small flames, pushing the darkness back into the corners where it settles like a patient cat. The spinner turns next to the high windows, and you notice how the blackness outside has softened almost imperceptibly, the glass now showing a thin, watery grey rather than solid night. One shutter is unlatched and folded back, but only halfway, so that a narrow vertical gap of morning twilight enters the room, bringing with it the faintest hint of the street's damp cobblestones and the distant smell of a baker's first oven somewhere across the rooftops. This new light is cool and colourless, and it falls across the spinning wheel and the work table in a pale stripe that mingles with the candle glow without overpowering it, making the shadows less sharp and revealing the fine layer of dust that has settled overnight on the wide floorboards. The spinner does not hasten to open the second shutter, leaving the room in a half-light that feels suspended between night and day, a quiet interval where time stretches without hurry. With the light adjusted, the spinner approaches the spinning wheel and stands for a moment in front of it, her gaze travelling over the drive band, the hub, the treadle, as though greeting each part in turn. You see her press a thumb gently against the leather drive band, testing the tension with a slight depression, and the band yields just enough to indicate the correct tightness, not so loose that it would slip, and not so taut that it would strain the spindle. She gives the large wheel a slow experimental push with one finger, and it turns half a rotation in silence, the spokes moving through the stripe of window light like the slow hand of a clock, before coming to rest again. Satisfied, she kneels beside the wheel and takes a small leather oil crute from a shelf underneath, uncorking it and allowing a single drop of oil to fall onto the spindle shaft where it meets the bearing. The drop spreads in a tiny, glistening circle, and the metal absorbs it without sound, leaving only a faint, clean smell that rises briefly and then fades. Now the work table itself must be prepared, and you watch as the spinner lifts a clean linen cloth from a stack kept in a shallow cupboard beneath the table, shaking it once to release the creases, the fabric snapping softly in the still air before settling onto the wooden surface. The cloth is smoothed with both hands, the palms pressing outward from the center to the edges so that no wrinkle remains and every corner hangs evenly over the sides, a perfect rectangle of pale cream that overlaps the older, more worn cloth beneath it. The candle flames sway for a moment at the disturbance of air, then steady again and the new cloth seems to brighten the entire workspace, reflecting the light upward and making the small objects upon it stand out with greater clarity. The spinner then turns her attention to the shallow wooden tray that holds the raw silk filament, lifting it from its place on the second stool and carrying it to the work table with the same careful grit one might use for a bowl full of water. The tray is set down in the exact center of the linen cloth, and the bundles of silk inside shift slightly, a soft rustle that is the loudest sound in the room for a brief moment before it subsides. Under the combined candle glow and the grey dawn light, the silk reveals its true color, a pale cream that is almost ivory but touched with a faint warmth, like the inner petal of a white rose before it fully opens. You see the spinner lean forward and examine the filaments without touching them, her eyes moving slowly over the coiled strands, checking for any tangle or broken piece. Finding none, she reaches into the tray and selects a single filament from the top of a bundle, lifting it with a thumb and forefinger so delicately that the silk seems to rise of its own accord, a ghost of a thread barely visible until it catches the light. This single strand is held up to the nearest candle, drawn between her hands to a length of about 2 feet, and turned slowly so that the flame's glow traverses its entire path. The silk shimmers with an even, unbroken sheen, and the spinner watches this shimmer with the patience of someone for whom such inspection is as natural as breathing. After a long moment, she lowers the filament and carries it to the guide pegs set into the tabletop, those 2 small wooden posts that rise no higher than a thumb's length. The far end of the filament is laid across the first peg and secured with a simple loop and a half-hitch knot, the knot tightened with a tug so slight that the silk barely registers the pressure. Then the free end is drawn across the width of the linen cloth and laid over the second peg, where it is also knotted, leaving a straight taut line of silk suspended a finger's breadth above the fabric, a clean horizontal path that will soon carry gold, but for now carries only the patient anticipation of the morning. The silk strand in place, the spinner turns to the copper bowl that sits at the corner of the work table, lifting it with both hands and carrying it to a small stoneware pitcher that rests on the floor near the wall. The pitcher is filled with clean water drawn from the workshop's supply, and the water pours into the copper bowl with a soft musical trickle, the sound of it cascading against the metal rim before settling into a shallow pool that fills the bowl halfway. The bowl is returned to the table, and now its surface reflects not only the candle flame, but also the pale stripe of window light, the 2 illuminations competing gently on the water's skin. A square of clean linen rag, kept folded beside the pitcher, is dipped into the water until it absorbs just enough to become damp but not dripping, and the spinner wrings it out over the bowl with a single twist, the excess water beading and falling back in tiny bright droplets that barely disturb the surface. With the damp cloth now held in one hand, the spinner wipes the fingertips of the other hand, pressing each finger against the cool, moist linen in a slow, individual motion. The thumb wiped first, then the index finger, the middle, the ring, the little finger, each one receiving equal attention. The operation is then repeated in reverse, the damp cloth transferred to the wiped hand so that the opposite fingers can be cleansed in their turn, and by the time it is done, every fingertip is clean and slightly cool, free of any dust or natural oil that might disturb the delicate gold leaf later. The damp cloth is folded and set aside on the corner of the table, where it will remain within easy reach, its moisture slowly evaporating into the still workshop air. The spinner now stands quite still for a moment, looking over the prepared workspace with a calm, unhurried gaze that takes in the 3 candles, the half-open shutter, the oiled wheel, the fresh linen cloth, the suspended silk strand, the copper bowl reflecting twin lights. Everything is in its place, every small preliminary task completed, and the quiet that follows is a different kind of quiet, not the waiting silence of the empty room before dawn, but a companionable stillness shared between the worker and the tools, a pause that is itself a form of work. You feel your own breathing deepen without your noticing, matching the slow rhythm of the morning, and the low bench that holds you seems to grow more comfortable, inviting you to settle further into the calm observation of what will come next. The spinner moves at last to the stool beside the spinning wheel, lowering herself onto the worn hollow of the seat with the same careful grace that has governed every action since she entered. She does not immediately reach for the gold leaf or touch the wheel's treadle. Instead, she sits with her hands resting loosely on her knees, her gaze drifting toward the silk strand as if greeting an old friend, her eyes following its straight path from peg to peg. Outside the narrow gap of the shutter, the grey light has brightened just a little more, catching the upper edge of a roof opposite and turning it from charcoal to soft slate. And somewhere further away, the first sparrow of the morning begins a tentative, drowsy chirp that comes through the glass as a muted thread of sound before trailing away. The workshop waits, entirely ready, and the spinner waits too, suspended in the last moment before the true labor of the day begins. A moment that stretches and holds, allowing you to rest within it for as long as you need. The spinner remains seated for a time on the worn stool, her breathing slow and even, her gaze still resting on the silk strand that stretches between the two guide pegs with the quiet tension of a harp string waiting to be plucked. The candles have burned down a little further, the original stub now a pool of liquid wax with a small charred wick leaning to one side, while the two fresh tapers continue to glow with steady, upright flames. Through the half-open shutter, the grey light of early morning has strengthened into a cool silver wash, catching the edges of the cedar boxes on the work table and revealing the fine grain of the wood. The faint traces of fingertip wear around the clasps. You feel the bench beneath you as something solid and timeless, your own stillness now so deep that you have become part of the workshop's quiet, an observer folded into the dim corner like another piece of patient furniture. At last the spinner leans forward, her stool giving the smallest creak, and reaches toward the row of cedar boxes on the work table. Her hand hovers above them for a moment, not from hesitation, but from a habit of reverence, and then she selects the box closest to the candle, drawing it toward her with a gentle pull that makes no sound beyond the soft friction of wood on linen. The box is small, no larger than a flattened prayer book, its lid fitted so precisely that the seam between lid and base is barely visible, a hairline of shadow that marks the boundary between closed and open. The wood itself is pale and fragrant, and as the box approaches you catch a sharper note of cedar, clean and dry, cutting through the beeswax and silk smells that have filled your senses until now. The spinner places both thumbs on the lid and presses upward with a slow, even pressure, the lid sliding free with a faint sandy whisper as the inner surfaces rub together. Inside the box, the gold leaf waits in a neat stack of thin squares, each one separated from its neighbor by a slip of tissue paper so fine that it appears almost transparent, a ghost material that crinkles at the slightest disturbance. The gold itself is not the heavy, brilliant yellow of a coin or a crown, but a paler, more luminous gold, beaten to a thinness that seems impossible, a thinness that defies the nature of metal. When the candlelight falls upon the topmost square, the gold glows with a soft internal radiance, and you can see the flame right through it as though looking at the sun through a closed eyelid, a warm amber presence filtered and gentled. For a long moment, the spinner simply looks at the gold, her face calm and expressionless, her eyes tracing the subtle variations of color across the surface, the way the light pulls more brightly in the center and fades to a softer gleam at the edges, where the beating was slightly thinner. She tilts the box a fraction, and the gold leaf shifts, the entire stack settling with a sound quieter than a moth's wing brushing against a window pane. The tissue paper between the squares crinkles again, a sound so brief and delicate that it passes before you can fully register it, leaving only the memory of a whisper. Then the spinner sets the open box down on the work table, positioning it just to the left of the leather pad, and the gold leaf waits, exposed now to the air of the room, but still protected by its tissue guards. A treasure that holds no greed in this place, only purpose. Next, the spinner reaches for the fine camel hair brush that has been lying beside the leather pad throughout the night, its bone handle gleaming with the soft patina of long use. She lifts the brush with the same delicate grip she used for the silk filament, holding it between thumb and forefinger as though it were a writing quill, the bristles fanning out into a soft, translucent tip that trembles almost imperceptibly with the natural shake of a steady hand. She examines the bristles in the candlelight, turning the brush slowly to see if any stray hair has splayed outward or any dust has settled among the fibers, and finding none, she gives the brush a single, light puff of breath, a brief exhalation that sends the bristles quivering for a moment before they settle back into their perfect alignment. The breath carries no moisture, only the faint warmth of the spinner's presence, and the brush is now entirely ready. The leather pad is drawn closer, its surface a dark, matte rectangle that has been burnished by years of service into a smooth, almost waxy consistency. Embedded in the grain of the leather, you can see the faintest traces of gold dust. Tiny particles that caught in the microscopic crevices and now lend the pad a subtle shimmer when the light falls at the right angle, a shimmer that is not gaudy, but instead suggests the accumulated history of countless gentle operations. The spinner runs a fingertip over the pad, testing its surface for any grit or unevenness, her touch so light that the leather does not even dimple beneath the pressure. Satisfied, she aligns the pad precisely parallel to the edge of the table, squaring it with the linen cloth and the cedar box, a small act of ordering that takes only a few seconds, but seems to settle the entire workspace into a deeper harmony. Now the spinner lifts the brush again and brings it to the open cedar box, the bristles poised just above the topmost tissue slip that protects the first square of gold leaf. With a movement so slow it could be measured by the melting of wax, she slides the tip of the brush beneath the edge of the tissue, lifting it with a gentle upward curl until the paper peels away and reveals the gold leaf beneath. A perfect, unbroken square of gilded light that seems to float on the surface of the stack. The tissue is laid aside on the far corner of the table, where it curls slightly at the edges, still holding the phantom impression of the gold it once covered. The exposed gold leaf is now vulnerable to the air, and you see it tremble, just barely, as the spinner's own breath moves across the table, the gold rippling like the surface of a pond, touched by the gentlest puff of wind. The brush is cleaned again with a single absent stroke against the edge of the leather pad, a touch that removes any invisible dust, and then the spinner lowers the bristles toward the gold leaf with the focused attention of someone balancing a feather on a needle's point. The bristles make contact at the very corner of the square, the soft hairs flattening slightly against the metal, and through some quiet interaction of static and surface tension, the gold leaf adheres to the brush, lifting upward as the spinner raises her hand. The leaf rises into the air without tearing, without folding, a thin sheet of gold suspended from the brush's tip and undulating in slow liquid waves, the candlelight passing through it and casting a golden shadow on the linen cloth below. The sight is so delicate, so improbable, that you find yourself holding your own breath, and the spinner pauses for a moment to let the leaf settle, the airborne gold gradually calming until it hangs as flat and still as a tiny curtain. She carries the gold leaf across the short distance to the leather pad, the journey taking several full seconds because each shift of air must be accounted for, each gentle sway of the leaf predicted and compensated with a counterform movement of the wrist. When the brush hovers directly above the dark rectangle of the pad, the spinner lowers it with the same excruciating slowness, and the gold leaf settles onto the leather with a touch so faint that no sound is produced, only a subtle change in the light as the gold finds its new resting place. The leaf flies flat and square on the dark leather, its edges perfectly aligned with the pad's boundaries, and the contrast between the luminous gold and the deep brown of the hide makes the metal glow even more brightly, a rectangle of captured sunrise resting in the middle of the workshop. The camel hair brush is set down on its side, the bristles lifted clear of the table so that no stray material adheres to them, and the spinner now picks up the flat wooden spatula with the polished tip, the tool that will be used to position the gold leaf precisely where it needs to go. The spatula is a simple instrument, a slip of boxwood sanded smooth and rubbed with beeswax until it gleams, its tip shaped like a miniature butter knife, thin and slightly flexible. She holds it like a painter holds a palette knife, the handle resting in the palm while the fingers guide the tip with fine control, and she brings the spatula to the edge of the gold leaf on the leather pad, sliding the polished wood beneath the nearest corner with a movement so shallow that it barely disturbs the metal. The corner lifts, and the spatula is advanced a fraction more, the gold leaf now balancing on the wooden tip like a golden sail catching a breeze that does not exist. The spinner uses the spatula to coax the leaf into a more central position on the pad, nudging it by minuscule degrees until it sits exactly where she wants it, the entire process unfolding with the hypnotic patience of a cloud crossing a still sky. Every adjustment is so small that it is almost invisible, and if you were to blink, you might miss the movement entirely, seeing only the before and the after, with no sense of the transition between them. Yet the spinner does not hurry, and you have no desire to hurry either, your own sense of time stretching to match the rhythm of her hands. With the gold leaf properly centered on the leather pad, the spinner now directs her attention to the silk filament that has been waiting between the guide pegs, the taut cream-colored strand that will become the core of the gilded thread. She turns on her stool to face the strand more directly, and she takes up the damp linen cloth from the corner of the table, pressing it once more to her fingertips with the same ritualistic care she used earlier, the cool moisture guaranteeing that no natural oil from her skin will interfere with the gold's adhesion. The cloth is set aside and she reaches toward the silk strand with her bare fingers, touching it at the very end where it is knotted around the first guide peg. Her touch so light that the strand does not vibrate. She pinches the silk between thumb and forefinger at a point about an inch from the knot, and with her other hand she lifts the brush once more, the bristles once again cleaned with a flick against the leather. The brush is brought to the gold leaf on the pad, and this time she touches the bristles to the gold, not at the corner but near the center. A delicate dab that picks up the entire leaf in one smooth adherence, lifting it clear of the leather and into the air where it undulates like a living thing. The brush carries the gold leaf across the short space to the silk filament, and you watch as the spinner aligns the leading edge of the gold with the very beginning of the silk's exposed length, just beyond the knot at the peg. The gold leaf is lowered until it touches the silk, and the moment of contact is marked by a soft, almost soundless transfer, the gold releasing from the brush and adhering to the silk with the help of the faint residual moisture left on the fiber from the damp cloth earlier. A moisture so slight that it cannot be seen, only inferred from the perfect instant bond that forms. The brush is withdrawn, and now a portion of the silk strand, about 2 inches long, is covered in gold leaf. The pale cream core completely hidden beneath a spiral of luminous metal that clings tight and smooth, the gold conforming to the silk surface like a second skin. The spinner examines this initial gold-wrapped section with a close, quiet scrutiny, rotating the strand slightly between her fingertips so that the light plays along its length, checking that no silk peeps through and that the gold leaf has not wrinkled or folded upon itself. The inspection reveals a tiny gap at the very edge, a sliver of cream silk barely thicker than a hair that remains uncovered, and the spinner addresses this by picking up a second square of gold leaf from the cedar box with the brush, using the same slow, floating technique to carry it across to the silk. The second leaf is applied so that it overlaps the first by a margin no greater than an eyelash's width, the overlap creating a seamless continuation of gold that erases the gap entirely. The brush smooths the leaf down with the faintest stroking motion, the bristles passing over the gold like a whisper over still water, pressing the metal into perfect contact with the silk and with the underlying leaf, bonding them all together into a single, unbroken length of gilded thread. The overlapping area is invisible to your eyes, the gold merging with gold so completely that you would never know where one leaf ended and the next began, and this invisible join is the mark of the spinner's skill. A skill so practiced that it has become entirely unremarkable, just another small action in a day full of small actions. The wooden spatula is called upon once more to attend to a tiny irregularity at the far edge of the second leaf, a corner that is lifted away from the silk by a fraction so small that only the most patient eye could detect it. The spinner slides the polished tip of the spatula beneath the lifted corner and presses it down again, the wood smoothing the gold against the silk with a pressure that is more intention than force, a mere suggestion of direction, that the gold obeys because it has been beaten so thin that it has forgotten how to resist. The corner stays down, the gold flat and even, and the spatula is set aside once more, its work complete for the moment. The section of gold-wrapped silk now extends about 4 inches from the guide peg, a short but perfect length of gilded thread that gleams with a soft, warm light, the gold wrapping the silk core in a spiral that follows the natural twist of the filament. The spinner does not hurry to continue. Instead, she pauses, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the work table, her gaze moving from the gold thread to the leather pad to the open cedar box, checking the state of her materials with a quiet mindfulness. The workshop around her remains silent and still, the 3 candles burning with unwavering flames, the half-open shutter admitting a little more of the morning's silver light, the distant sparrow still chirping in its drowsy, intermittent rhythm. Nothing in the room suggests urgency, nothing demands speed, and the spinner seems to belong to this slow rhythm as naturally as the river belongs to its bed, her movements an extension of the quiet, rather than an interruption of it. You watch from your bench, the stillness of your own body now so complete that you have lost track of where the bench ends and your limbs begin. The boundary between observer and observed grown indistinct. The gold leaf continues to wait in its cedar box. The brush rests on the table, the damp cloth slowly dries, and the spinner breathes in and out with the same measured pace as the turning of the earth. The morning advances by imperceptible degrees, the light shifting from silver to palest pearl, and still the workshop holds its peace, a bubble of calm suspended in the heart of Lyon, a place where gold and silk and patience are woven together into something that will outlast sleep itself. The spinner remains in her pause for a span of time that cannot be measured by the clock, but only by the slow shift of the candle flames. The original stub now guttering in a pool of wax that has spread to the very edge of its brass holder, while the 2 fresh tapers continue their steady, upright glow. Outside the half-open shutter, the morning has advanced from silver to a soft, pale pearl, the rooftops of Lyon now clearly visible in their grey, sloping geometry, the occasional wisp of chimney smoke rising straight into the windless air. You have grown so accustomed to the quiet that the smallest sounds have become distinct. The faint settling of ash in the candle wick, the distant murmur of a street vendor rolling a cart over cobblestones somewhere far below, the almost inaudible creak of the bench as your own weight shifts by a fraction. The gold-wrapped length of silk still stretches from the guide peg, its 4 inches of gilded surface catching the combined light of candles and morning and holding it with the soft, patient gleam of a promise about to be fulfilled. Now the spinner rises from her stool with the same deliberate grace that has governed every movement since she first hung her cloak on the peg, and she crosses the short distance to the spinning wheel, her footsteps light on the wide floorboards. She lowers herself onto the stool beside the wheel, the one with the seat worn into a shallow hollow that fits her exactly, and she adjusts her position with a small, settling motion, her feet finding the treadle and resting upon it without yet pressing down. The great wheel stands before her, its polished rim catching the light and reflecting it as a soft, curved line that runs all the way around, and the drive band loops in its quiet figure, 8 from the large wheel to the small spindle pulley, waiting for motion. The spindle itself, a slender shaft of tempered steel, points toward the work table like a compass needle pointing north, and the bobbin mounted upon it is still bare except for a few starter turns of plain silk that were wound on at the end of the previous day. The spinner reaches across to the work table and takes up the silk filament with its 4 inches of gold wrapping, lifting it carefully from the guide pegs by slipping the loop's knots free, the silk releasing with a soft, frictionless surrender. She draws the filament toward the wheel, guiding it through the air with a hand held low to avoid any sudden draft that might disturb the gold leaf, and she threads the bare end through a small guide eye mounted on the spindle housing, a tiny porcelain ring that directs the incoming thread onto the bobbin at the proper angle. The end is passed through the eye and wound twice around the bobbin's core, the thread crossing over itself in a simple locking knot that requires no tightening, only the natural friction of silk on silk to hold it firm. The gold-wrapped portion of the thread now hangs in a shallow catenary curve between the work table and the spinning wheel, its weight so slight that it barely tugs at the guide eye, and the spinner leans back a little on her stool, her posture settling into the relaxed, upright stance of someone who will not move again for a very long time. Now her foot presses down on the treadle, and the great wheel begins to turn. The first rotation is slow and almost silent, the wooden spokes advancing through the stripe of window light one by one, the hub turning in its oiled bearing with a smoothness that produces no friction, only a low woody hum that fills the room like the sound of a distant, contented bee. The treadle rises again under the pressure of the drive band's return, and the spinner's foot follows it upward without resistance, already pressing down again as the wheel completes its first full circuit and begins a second, the rhythm establishing itself within the span of 3 heartbeats. The sound of the wheel is a steady, repeating whisper punctuated by the soft creak of the treadle on its hinge, a wooden note that marks the downstroke of each rotation, and this combination of hum and creak becomes the workshop's pulse, a slow, living heartbeat that you feel as much as hear. The spinner's hands now take up their separate duties. Her left hand feeds the plain silk filament from the shallow tray on the work table, drawing it upward in a steady, controlled stream, the silk passing through her fingers with a gentle, constant friction that regulates its speed and keeps the tension even. The filament travels from the tray up to the guide pegs, which have been left empty for this stage, and from there it passes across the open space to the guide eye of the spinning wheel, entering the mechanism as a plain, cream-colored thread and emerging wrapped around the growing bobbin. Her right hand moves to the leather pad on the work table, where a fresh square of gold leaf has been positioned with the brush, and as the wheel turns and the silk advances, she lifts the gold leaf on the camel hair bristles and carries it toward the moving thread with the same slow, floating approach she used earlier, timing her movement to the rhythm of the treadle. The gold leaf meets the silk just before the guide eye, at the point where the filament is still stretched taut and straight, and the spinner applies it with a delicate sweeping motion that wraps the gold around the silk in a single, continuous action, the leaf adhering instantly to the damp, prepared surface and conforming to the thread's curve without a single wrinkle or fold. The gold layer spirals around the cream core as the thread advances, and because the silk is already turning slightly from the twist imparted by the spinning process, the gold leaf wraps in a natural angled spiral that covers every part of the silk without leaving gaps. The spinner's right hand returns to the leather pad for another square of gold leaf, even as the left hand continues to feed the silk, the two hands working in a slow, complementary rhythm that never hurries and never pauses. A duet of deliberate motion set to the steady beat of the wheel. You watch this process repeat itself many times over, each repetition so similar to the last that they blur into a single continuous flow of silk and gold, the wheel humming, the treadle creaking, the brush lifting, the gold floating across the gap, the gold adhering, the silk advancing, the bobbin growing. The variations from one cycle to the next are so small that they would escape any notice but the closest, the way the candle flame on the work table dips by a hair's breadth each time the brush passes near it, the way the spinner's foot adjusts its pressure on the treadle by an ounce to compensate for the changing diameter of the bobbin, the way a tiny flake of gold dust detaches from the edge of a leaf and drifts down to settle on the linen cloth like a single flake of metallic snow. The morning light continues to strengthen outside the shutter, its color shifting from pearl to a pale, watery gold as the sun climbs higher behind the rooftops. And this new light falls directly onto the spinning point, making the gold flash brightly each time a new leaf wraps around the silk, a miniature pulse of brilliance that marks every fresh addition to the thread. The bobbin fills gradually, almost imperceptibly, its diameter increasing by the thickness of a few silk filaments with each rotation, and after what might be several minutes or half an hour, the originally bare core has grown a plump layer of gilded thread that catches every light source in the room. The gold on the bobbin gleams not with a uniform shine, but with a mosaic of tiny highlights, each spiral of gold leaf reflecting the candles, the window, the whitewashed walls in a shifting pattern that changes as the bobbin turns. The spinner does not stop to admire this effect. Her attention remains fixed on the meeting point of silk and gold and brush, the tiny zone of transformation where plain filament becomes precious thread, and her vigilance is quiet and unbroken, a calm, unblinking focus that holds the entire process steady. The sound of the wheel changes slightly as the bobbin grows heavier, the hum deepening by a fraction, the wooden frame of the spinning wheel absorbing the new weight and adjusting its resonance to match. The spinner feels this change through the treadle before she hears it, a subtle increase in resistance that tells her the bobbin's mass has shifted the balance of the mechanism, and she accommodates it without conscious thought, her foot pressing with a touch more force on the downstroke and relaxing a touch more on the upstroke, her body and the wheel engaged in a quiet conversation that requires no words. The leather drive band flexes and relaxes with each rotation, its surface polished to a dull gloss by years of passing around the wooden wheel, and it gives off the faintest smell of warm hide, a clean, animal scent that mingles with the cedar and beeswax and silk. At intervals that seem to follow no pattern but the spinner's own internal clock, she pauses the wheel to examine the growing thread. Her foot lifts from the treadle, and the great wheel slows, its momentum carrying it through several more rotations before it stops entirely. The last turns so slow that each spoke passes through the window light as though wading through honey. The silence that follows is abrupt after the long hum, a sudden, pillowy stillness that seems to press against your ears, and in this silence the spinner leans forward to inspect the bobbin. She takes a length of the gilded thread between her thumb and forefinger, drawing it out a few inches from the bobbin, and she holds it up to the nearest candle, rotating it slowly, so that the light glides along the spiral of gold, checking for any gap, any irregularity, any place where the silk core shows through. The inspection lasts a full minute, the thread turned and turned again until every angle has been examined, and finding nothing to correct, she lets the thread retract onto the bobbin and resumes her position at the treadle, the wheel starting up again with the same smooth, accelerating hum that began its first rotation. A second pause comes later, prompted not by the inspection routine, but by a small maintenance task. The spindle shaft has developed a barely audible ticking sound, a tiny irregularity in the rotation that only the most attuned ear could detect. The spinner hears it immediately, and she stops the wheel to apply another drop of oil from the small leather crute, the oil running down the shaft and into the bearing with a glistening bead that eliminates the tick and restores the pure, woody hum. The wheel restarts, and the work continues, the interruption so brief and so calmly handled that it barely registers as an event, only as another small necessary gesture in a day composed entirely of small necessary gestures. The light through the shutter has now shifted to a clear, pale gold, the sun having climbed high enough to clear the opposite rooftops and cast a direct beam into the workshop, a beam that falls across the spinning wheel and illuminates the floating dust motes that drift through the air, stirred by the motion of the wheel. These motes rise and fall in slow, invisible currents, catching the light one by one and glowing for a moment like tiny stars before fading back into the dimmer air. A galaxy of dust suspended in the sunbeam, and the spinner works within this galaxy, her hands passing through it without disturbing the slow gravitational dance. You watch the dust motes spiraling upward in the warm air above the candles, then descending again near the cool stone of the wall, a gentle circulation that mirrors the large rhythms of the workshop, the turning of the wheel, the feeding of the silk, the application of the gold. The bobbin now holds a substantial length of finished gold thread, its surface a smooth, shining cylinder of gilded silk that seems to emit its own light rather than merely reflect the light around it, and the spinner pauses for a third time, not to inspect but simply to rest. Her foot lifts from the treadle, the wheel slows and stops, and she places her hands flat on her knees, her shoulders rising and falling with a single deeper breath that releases the quiet tension of sustained focus. She does not look at the clock, for there is no clock in the workshop. She does not look at the sky, for the window is too high and narrow to show more than a sliver of atmosphere. She simply rests in the moment, her eyes half closing, her body still and balanced on the worn stool, a human pause in the long, slow rhythm of the day. The gold thread waits on the bobbin, the silk waits in the tray, the gold leaf waits in the cedar box, and the workshop itself seems to breathe out, settling into a deeper stillness that holds everything suspended, allowing you to sink further into the quiet, your own rest deepening as the spinner's rest deepens, the boundaried entirely with Nork and stillness grown so thin that it has vanished entirely. The spinner's rest stretches on for a space of time that feels neither long nor short, measured only by the slow, silent drift of the dust motes through the sunbeam and the barely perceptible shift of the shadows on the floorboards. Her hands remain flat on her knees, the fingers slightly curled, the thumbs resting against the soft linen of her working clothes, and her breathing has settled into a rhythm so calm and shallow that her shoulders barely rise and fall. The 3 candles on the work table have now burned down to varying heights, the original stub, reduced to a shapeless mound of cooled wax with a blackened wick, collapsed into it, the 2 fresher tapers still holding their form but visibly shorter, their flames steady and upright in the still air. Through the half-open shutter the morning has ripened into full daylight, the rooftops of Lyon now glowing with a warm, sandy color, that speaks of sun on old tile, and the stripe of light that falls across the spinning wheel has broadened and deepened, moving slowly across the floor as the sun continues its own unhurried arc. At length, the spinner opens her eyes fully and gives a small, quiet sigh, a sound that is not weariness but release, the kind of exhalation that marks the end of one thing and the gentle beginning of another. She rises from the stool beside the spinning wheel and crosses to the work table, her footsteps still light and careful, though the floorboards no longer creak now that the day has warmed them. She reaches toward the shortest candle, the one that has gutted out entirely, and she lifts the brass holder with a steady hand, carrying it to a small shelf near the door where a clay dish waits to receive spent stubs. The holder is set down, the dead wick and wax discarded into the dish with a soft click, and the brass is wiped clean with a corner of the linen cloth before being returned to its place on the table. This small act of tidying is performed without haste or ceremony, a natural gesture like brushing a fallen leaf from a step, and when it is done the spinner turns to the remaining 2 candles. She leans forward and, with a gentle rounded breath, blows out the first flame, her lips pursing just enough to direct a thin stream of air at the wick, the flame bending sideways and vanishing into a curl of grey smoke that rises straight upward before dissipating into the sunbeam. The second candle follows a moment later, extinguished with the same soft puff, and now the workshop is illuminated solely by the daylight that enters through the narrow gap of the shutter, a clean, white gold light that changes every surface it touches, revealing details that the candle glow had kept hidden. The smoke from the 2 extinguished wicks hangs in the air for a few seconds, a thin, translucent ribbon that twists slowly in the warmth before fading into nothing, and the smell of beeswax, now freed from the heat of the flames, becomes softer and cooler, a gentle note in the larger fragrance of the room. The spinner now moves to the shutter, and with a single motion of both hands, folds it fully open, the wooden panel swinging outward on its iron hinges with a low, contented groan that seems to announce the arrival of full morning. The light that floods into the workshop is no longer a narrow stripe, but a broad, generous wash that covers the spinning wheel, the work table, the floorboards, and even reaches into the corner where you sit on your low bench, warming the air around you by a perceptible degree. The high windows, still closed on the other sides, hold panes of glass that are now revealed to be slightly wavy, with tiny bubbles caught in the thickness, and these imperfections scatter the daylight into a soft, diffuse glow that fills the room without harsh shadows. Outside you can see a square of pale blue sky above the rooftops, the first blue you have glimpsed since before dawn, and the sight of it brings a sense of openness, of the world beyond the workshop continuing its quiet, ordinary morning. With the room now fully lit, the spinner turns her attention to the tools and surfaces that have served through the early hours, and she begins a slow, methodical inventory of every object in the workshop, her gaze traveling from one thing to the next with the calm attention of someone taking stock of a familiar and beloved landscape. The leather pad on the work table is lifted and examined on both sides, the dark surface still holding its faint scatter of gold dust, and a corner of the damp linen cloth is used to wipe away the loose particles, the gold transferring to the cloth in a smudge of pale shimmer that the spinner regards for a moment before setting the cloth aside. The camel hair brush is picked up next, its bristles inspected in the daylight with a close, careful scrutiny, and a single stray hair that has worked its way loose is plucked free and discarded. The brush then tucked into a small pottery jar that stands at the back of the table, a jar that holds several other brushes of varying fineness, all waiting for their turn to serve. The wooden spatula is wiped clean on the same damp cloth and laid flat on the table, its polished tip gleaming in the sunlight like a sliver of honey frozen into wood, and the small copper bowl of water is lifted and carried to a corner of the room where a stone basin drains into a pipe that leads away beneath the floor. The water is poured out with a gentle splashing sound that echoes briefly against the stone, and the bowl is refilled from the pitcher, fresh water trickling into the copper vessel with the same soft musical note it made before dawn. The bowl is returned to its place on the table, and now its surface holds a reflection of the whitewashed ceiling, a pale, watery square that trembles slightly with the vibration of the spinner's footsteps. The open cedar box of gold leaf is closed with a careful press of the lid, the seal restored with a soft sandy whisper, and the box is returned to its place in the row with its companions, the pale wood aligning perfectly with the others. The tissue slips that were set aside during the earlier work are gathered into a neat stack and stored in a separate small drawer beneath the table, a drawer that holds many such slips from many previous days, a quiet archive of the invisible separators that have guarded the gold. The spinner's movements remain unhurried and gentle, each small task flowing into the next without any sense of sequence, as though tidying the workshop is not a separate activity, but a continuation of the spinning itself, another form of the same patient attention. Now the spinner steps back from the work table and surveys the floor, where a few stray fibers of silk have drifted down during the morning's work and now lie curled on the wide planks like tiny, pale commas. She retrieves a small hand broom from a hook near the door, a simple tool of bound twigs with a worn wooden handle, and she sweeps the floor in slow, even strokes that gather the silk fibers and a little ordinary dust into a small pile near the threshold. The pile is collected with a flat pan of beaten tin and emptied into a clay jar that stands beside the door. A jar that holds the sweepings of many days, its contents a soft, greyish mass of silk fragments and workshop dust, and the occasional dried petal of wax. The broom and pan are returned to their hook, and the spinner washes her hands in the clean water of the copper bowl, the water beading on her skin and dripping back with a sound like tiny bells. The simple meal that the spinner now takes is so modest and so quietly consumed that it barely registers as an interruption to the workshop's rhythm. From a small basket that sits on a shelf near the door, she takes a heel of bread, a wedge of pale cheese wrapped in a square of linen, and a small earthenware cup that she fills with water from the pitcher. She carries these to the low bench near the window, the one that is not yours, and she sits with her back against the whitewashed wall, her face turned toward the square of blue sky visible through the open shutter. The bread is torn into small pieces, each one eaten slowly, the cheese nibbled in tiny bites, and the water sipped without hurry. The spinner chews with a steady, mechanical calm, her jaw working in slow circles, her gaze distant and unfocused, resting on the rooftops and the chimney smoke, and the occasional pigeon that struts along the ridge tiles, its iridescent neck feathers catching the sun and flashing purple before it bobs out of sight. The meal lasts perhaps 10 minutes, or perhaps 20, the time marked only by the gradual disappearance of the bread and cheese and the slow emptying of the cup. And when it is done, the spinner brushes a few crumbs from her lap into her palm and carries them to the clay jar by the door, depositing them with the same gentle care she gave the sweepings. The cup is rinsed in the stone basin and set upside down on a wooden rack to dry, a rack that holds several other cups in identical positions, their rims leaving circular watermarks on the wood. The linen wrapping from the cheese is folded into a neat square and returned to the basket, and the basket is pushed back onto its shelf, where it will wait until the next meal, whenever that may be. With the meal concluded and the workshop tidied, the spinner stands for a moment in the center of the room, her hands loose at her sides, her posture relaxed and balanced. The daylight has now fully established itself, the sunbeam that fell across the spinning wheel having moved on to illuminate the far wall, where it reveals the subtle variations in the whitewash, the brushstrokes that have been invisible all morning, now standing out as faint ridges and hollows. The spinner's face in this light is calm and unreadable, the face of someone who has done this work for many years and will do it for many more, the face of someone for whom the passing of hours is not a countdown but a gentle, steady flow. She does not smile, but neither does she frown. She simply exists in the light, a figure of quiet, unremarkable presence, as much a part of the workshop as the spinning wheel or the cedar boxes. Then, without any announcement or transition, she returns to the stool beside the spinning wheel, her body settling into the worn hollow with the same ease as before, her feet finding the treadle, her hands lifting to their positions. She wets her fingertips once more on the damp cloth, a quick, habitual gesture, and she reaches for the silk filament that still trails from the work table to the guide eye, the bare cream thread waiting to be transformed. The great wheel is given a gentle push to start its rotation, the treadle is pressed, and the hum rises again, the same low, woody sound, the same steady rhythm, as though the pause had never happened. The brush lifts, the gold leaf floats across the gap, the gold wraps around the silk, and the bobbin continues its slow, incremental growth, the gilded surface gleaming in the daylight with a brightness that the candles could never have produced. The spinner works on, and the workshop settles back into its quiet pulse, the morning stretching ahead with no end in sight, only the steady, calming repetition of gold and silk and the turning of the wheel. The wheel turns on, its hum steady and low, a sound that has become so familiar to you that it has faded from your awareness into the background of the afternoon, surfacing only when you pause to notice it, and then sinking back into the quiet as soon as your attention drifts elsewhere. The spinner's foot presses the treadle with a motion that no longer seems deliberate, but rather a natural extension of her breathing, the downstroke matching each slow exhalation, the upstroke riding the gentle intake of air that follows, a cycle so smooth that the boundary between the spinner and the wheel has grown indistinct. The daylight that flooded the workshop after the shutter was opened has now reached its full, steady brightness, and holds there, suspended in the long plateau of midday, the sunbeam on the floorboards no longer moving fast enough for the eye to track, but crawling instead with the imperceptible pace of a shadow on a sundial. The bobbin has grown since the morning's work resumed, its diameter now perhaps half again what it was when the candles were extinguished, and the gold thread wrapped around it catches the daylight in a dense, layered glow, the overlapping spirals of gold leaf creating a surface that seems almost liquid. A cylinder of captured sunlight that gleams with a soft, drowsy radiance. The spinner's left hand feeds the silk filament from the tray with the same steady, unvarying motion, her fingers guiding the cream-colored strand upward and across the guide pegs where it passes through the air in a shallow, trembling arc before reaching the guide eye of the spinning wheel. The silk never tangles, never snags, never breaks, because the spinner's touch is so practiced that it has become entirely reliable, a constant in the same way that the river's flow or the sun's arc is a constant. What you begin to notice now, as the afternoon stretches on without any event to mark its passage, are the small hidden details that were previously invisible to you, the tiny micro-adjustments and subtle patterns that repeat themselves over and over, so subtle that they would escape any casual glance but become apparent only after long, patient watching. You see, for instance, the way the spinner's left thumb rests against the tensioning peg that rises from the side of the spinning wheel's frame, a small turn knob of dark wood that controls the pressure on the drive band. Every few minutes, without any outward sign that she is counting or measuring, she gives this peg a quarter turn with her thumb, the motion so small and so practiced that it seems to happen on its own, the knob rotating by a tiny increment and then settling into its new position where it will hold until the bobbin grows a little more and the tension shifts again, requiring another quarter turn, another infinitesimal adjustment that keeps the whole mechanism in perfect balance. You notice also the leather pad on the work table, which has been receiving the gold leaf since the early morning and now carries upon its surface a fine golden fuzz, a microscopic layer of gold dust that has accumulated from the edges of the leaves as they were lifted and transferred. This golden fuzz is barely visible unless the light strikes the pad at the precise angle, and then it glimmers for a moment, a faint metallic bloom that seems to hover just above the dark leather, a ghost of all the gold that has passed across it. The spinner does not clean this fuzz away as she works, for it is too fine to interfere with the next leaf, and it will be wiped off at the end of the day in one final gesture of tidying, but for now it remains a silent record of the morning's labors, a dusting of gold so delicate that a single breath would scatter it. Another small detail presents itself as the bobbin fills, a soft clicking sound that occurs at regular intervals, not with every rotation of the wheel, but roughly every 8 or 10 revolutions. A tiny wooden tick that comes from the bobbin itself as its diameter reaches a certain point and the thread shifts slightly against the flange. This click is so quiet that you might easily miss it beneath the hum of the wheel and the creak of the treadle. But once you've noticed it, you find yourself listening for it, and it comes again, right on schedule, a small, reassuring point of punctuation in the long, unpunctuated sentence of the afternoon. The spinner does not react to the click. She has heard it 1,000 times before, and it is as much a part of the workshop's soundscape as the distant coo of the pigeons on the roof, or the occasional, muffled call of a vendor from the street below. The warmth of the afternoon begins to seep through the stone walls of the workshop, a slow, gradual penetration of heat that has nothing to do with the direct sunbeam and everything to do with the accumulated hours of daylight warming the masonry, the roof tiles, the very air that sits in the narrow street outside. The workshop, which was cool and fresh in the pre-dawn darkness, has now grown comfortably warm, the air carrying a faint, sleepy heaviness that makes your eyelids feel as though they have gained a little weight, your breathing deepening without your permission. The spinner seems unaffected by the warmth, or perhaps she is affected, but has long since learned to work through it, her movements remaining steady and precise even as a fine sheen of moisture appears on her brow, a sheen that she ignores, letting it evaporate naturally in the still, warm air. The silk filament continues to feed through her fingers, the gold leaf continues to float across the gap on the camel hair brush, the wheel continues to hum, and the bobbin continues to grow, its shape changing from a small, neat cylinder to something plumper and more substantial, a golden barrel that seems to swell almost imperceptibly with each passing minute. You watch this growth as you might watch the slow rise of dough in a warm kitchen, a process that is invisible in the moment, but undeniable when you look away and look back. The before and after, separated by a change that the eye cannot catch in real time. The gold thread wraps around the bobbin in tight, even layers, each new coil lying flush against its neighbor, and the surface of the bobbin becomes smoother and more brilliant as the layers build up, the underlying silk core completely hidden beneath the accumulated wealth of gold. At one point, after what might have been an hour or perhaps longer, the spinner lets out a very soft sigh, a sound that is not boredom or frustration or weariness, but simply a release of breath, the kind of sigh that comes when the body has been in one position for a long time and needs to reset itself. The sigh is so quiet that it barely disturbs the air, and it passes without comment, without any change in the rhythm of the work, the wheel humming on, the silk feeding through, the gold floating across. The spinner shifts her weight slightly on the stool, her spine straightening by a degree, and then she settles back into her previous posture, the sigh having served its purpose and been forgotten. The afternoon wears on in this manner, the shadow of the window frame moving across the floorboards with a slowness that makes the hour hand of a clock seem fast by comparison, each inch of progress marking perhaps half an hour, each foot marking the passage of the sun from its zenith toward the western rooftops. The light in the workshop begins to change its quality, losing the bright white clarity of midday and taking on the first hint of the golden hue that will deepen as evening approaches, a warmth that suffuses the air and makes the gold on the bobbin glow with a richer, deeper radiance. The spinner notices this change without looking up, her awareness of the light as much a part of her craft as her awareness of the tension on the drive band or the moisture on her fingertips, and she adjusts nothing, simply continues, her work pace to the sun's slow descent. The street outside has grown quieter as the afternoon has advanced, the morning bustle of carts and vendors giving way to the drowsy stillness of the post-prandial hours, when even the pigeons seem to nap on their roof, ridge perches, and the river murmurs more softly than before. The workshop absorbs this quiet and adds its own layer to it, the hum of the wheel and the creak of the treadle and the whisper of the brush becoming the only sounds in a world that seems to have paused for a collective rest. You feel your own body sinking deeper into the low bench, your muscles loose and heavy, your mind drifting along the steady current of the wheel's rhythm, asking nothing, expecting nothing, content to observe the slow golden accumulation that fills the afternoon. The spinner reaches the end of a silk filament and pauses to join a new one, her hands performing the tiny, precise knot with the same unhurried care she brings to every task. The two ends of cream, colored silk twisted together and smoothed flat so that the join is invisible, the gold leaf that will soon cover it, never knowing that a transition occurred. The new filament is fed from the tray, the wheel resumes its turning, and the work continues as though nothing had interrupted it, the brief pause already forgotten, swallowed by the larger rhythm of the day. The bobbin grows and grows, its golden surface now a repository of the afternoon's heat and light, a slumbering jewel that catches the sun and holds it, waiting for the evening when it will be removed and weighed and placed in the cedar box alongside its companions from previous days. Though that moment is still far off, still hidden behind the slow, steady turning of the wheel and the patient, endless feeding of the gold, the afternoon light has begun its slow turn toward gold, the white clarity of midday giving way to a deeper, mellower hue that falls across the workshop in long, slanting rectangles. The shadows of the window frames stretching across the floorboards like dark ribbons unspooled by the sun's descent. The spinner has been working without pause for a span of time that might be measured by the growth of the bobbin, now plump and heavy with layer upon layer of gilded thread, its surface a dense, luminous cylinder that seems to hold the warmth of the entire day within its tight-wound spirals. The hum of the great wheel has become a permanent feature of the room, a sound so steady and so enduring that you have ceased to notice it at all, your ears accepting it as they accept the sound of your own breath, a background rhythm that requires no attention. Now the spinner's foot lifts from the treadle, and the wheel begins to slow, its wooden spokes passing through the golden light with decreasing speed, each rotation more languid than the last, until the wheel stops entirely in a position that seems accidental, one spoke pointing toward the ceiling, another toward the floor. The sudden absence of the hum leaves a palpable silence in the room, a silence that feels thicker and softer than the silence before dawn, filled with the accumulated warmth of the afternoon and the faint, distant cooing of a pigeon on the roof outside. The spinner does not rise from her stool but instead leans forward, her attention fixed on the bobbin, and she reaches out with her right hand to draw a length of the finished gold thread from its surface, pulling it gently away from the mass and holding it up before her eyes. This is the first inspection, and it unfolds with the slow, ritual precision of a ceremony that has been performed so many times that every gesture has been refined to its simplest, most necessary form. The spinner holds the thread between her thumb and forefinger, pinching it lightly so that the gold is not crushed or marred, and she rotates it slowly, the thread turning in the light and revealing its spiral of gold leaf, each overlapping edge catching the sun at a different angle and flashing softly before fading as the rotation continues. Her eyes follow the rotation with a calm, unwavering focus, scanning every fraction of the thread's surface for any gap in the gold, any place where the cream silk core might show through, any irregularity in the lay of the leaf that could compromise the thread's perfection. The inspection covers the entire drawn length, perhaps 12 inches of gilded silk, and it takes a full minute because the spinner does not rush, does not skip any portion, does not allow her attention to wander from the tiny, luminous world suspended between her fingertips. Halfway along the drawn length her eyes pause, and she brings the thread closer to her face, her brow lowering by a fraction. A tiny speck of something, a mote of dust so small that it would be invisible to any casual glance, has settled on the gold and lodged there, a dark spot no larger than a grain of fine sand that interrupts the smooth gleam. The spinner does not frown or sigh, or show any sign of irritation. She simply reaches for the wooden spatula that lies on the work table, picking it up with her free hand and bringing its polished tip to the thread with the same delicate precision she uses for the gold leaf itself. The tip of the spatula touches the speck and lifts it away with a single, gentle flick, the mote drifting off into the air and vanishing into the sunbeam, and the spinner examines the spot again to be certain that no residue remains before lowering the thread and letting it retract back onto the bobbin with a soft, whispering release. The spatula is set down, and the spinner now lifts the entire bobbin from the spindle, cradling it in her palm and turning it over to examine the layers from every angle, checking that the thread has wound evenly without any ridge or hollow that could indicate a tension fault. The bobbin is smooth and regular, its surface a continuous, unbroken expanse of gold, and the spinner gives a small, almost imperceptible nod before sliding it back onto the spindle and seating it firmly against the flange. The first inspection is complete, and yet the spinner does not immediately return to work. Instead, she sits for a moment with her hands resting on her knees, her gaze drifting toward the open shutter where the sky has taken on the faintest blush of late afternoon, the blue deepening at its zenith while the rooftops glow with a warm terracotta light. The pause does not last long, and soon the treadle is pressed again. The wheel resumes its hum, the silk feeds through the guide eye, and the gold leaf floats across on the brush to wrap around the moving thread. The work continues with the same steady, unvarying rhythm, the bobbin growing by another layer, then another, the gold accumulating in silence while the shadows lengthen across the floor and the quality of the light shifts from gold to amber. The warmth in the workshop has not diminished, but it has changed. The dry heat of midday replaced by a softer, more enveloping warmth that seems to rise from the walls and the floorboards rather than from the sun. A stored heat that the stone is now releasing back into the room. After a period of uninterrupted spinning that might have lasted 20 minutes or 40, the spinner stops the wheel again, this time prompted not by her own internal clock, but by a subtle change in the sound of the mechanism. A faint, irregular tick that has crept into the hum, disturbing its perfect smoothness like a single grain of sand in a well-oiled bearing. She lifts her foot from the treadle and the wheel slows, the tick becoming more audible as the rotation decelerates, a tiny wooden click that occurs once per revolution and then fades as the wheel comes to rest. The spinner leans sideways on her stool and reaches beneath the wheel to the small lever cruet of oil that she keeps on the shelf there, uncorking it and applying a single drop to the spindle shaft where it meets the bearing, the oil sliding into the gap and silencing the tick before it can establish itself. She gives the wheel a gentle push to distribute the oil, and the rotation is smooth and silent again, the hum restored to its perfect woody resonance. With the wheel stopped anyway, the spinner decides to perform the second inspection, and she draws out another length of gold thread from the bobbin, perhaps the same 12 inches as before, or perhaps a little more, the exact measurement a matter of habit rather than precision. The inspection follows the same pattern. The thread is held up to the light, rotated slowly between thumb and forefinger, examined from end to end for any imperfection. The gold leaf lies flat and even, the spiral tight and regular, the overlap of each leaf invisible beneath the next, and the cream silk core is nowhere to be seen, hidden deep within its golden wrapping. The spinner turns the thread a full rotation, then another half rotation for good measure, and finding nothing to correct, she lets the thread retract and rests her hands on her knees again. Her breathing slow and even, her posture relaxed against the worn stool. The light through the shutter has now deepened to a rich, honeyed amber, the sun having descended far enough that its rays pass through a greater thickness of atmosphere and arrive in the workshop softened and colored, gilding every surface with a warmth that makes the gold thread on the bobbin seem almost incandescent. The whitewashed walls glow with a buttery tone, the dark wooden beams overhead appear touched with bronze, and even the air itself seems to hold a faint golden haze, the dust motes suspended in the sunbeam now looking like tiny flecks of amber rather than pale specks of dust. The spinner glances toward the window, gauging the height of the sun without any instrument, and she knows that evening is approaching but has not yet arrived, that there is still time for more work before the light fails entirely. She resumes her position, the wheel starts up again, and the spinning continues through the deepening afternoon, the bobbin now approaching its full capacity, its golden surface so dense and bright that it seems to weigh more heavily on the spindle, the mechanism adjusting to the extra mass with the quarter turns of the tensioning peg that the spinner's thumb delivers at the proper intervals. The silk in the tray is running low, the bundle that was full this morning now reduced to a few loose coils, and the spinner will need to fetch a fresh bundle before the evening's work is done, though that moment has not yet come. The gold leaf in the cedar box has also diminished, the stack of squares now visibly lower, the tissue slips accumulating in the small drawer beneath the table, a record of the day's consumption written in paper and gold dust. The third inspection comes as the light begins to fail, the amber deepening toward a soft, dusky rose, the shadows on the floorboards now so long that they touch the far wall and fold upward against the whitewash. The spinner stops the wheel not because the sound has changed or because a speck has been spotted, but simply because the light has reached a threshold where the gold thread can no longer be properly judged by daylight alone, its sparkle dimming in the growing dusk. She rises from the stool and crosses to the work table, where she takes up a fresh candle from the drawer and holds its wick to the ember of one of the earlier stubs that still glows faintly in its brass holder, the wick catching with a soft flare that pushes back the dusk and restores a circle of warm, steady light to the workspace. With the candle lit and placed in a holder beside the bobbin, the spinner draws out a length of thread for the third and final inspection of the day. The flames glow, revealing the gold with a different quality than the sun, a more intimate and focused light that picks out the fine details of the spiral and the subtle variations in the gold leaf's color. The places where the beating was slightly thinner and the metal appears paler, the places where it was slightly thicker and glows with a deeper trode. The thread is rotated slowly, the inspection following the same ritual as before, the same slow turn, the same close scrutiny, the same quiet satisfaction as no flaw is found and no correction is needed. The thread retracts onto the bobbin, and the spinner holds the bobbin up to the candle, turning it in the flame's glow so that its entire surface flashes and gleams, a final, comprehensive check that confirms what the other inspections have already established. The thread is perfect, ready to join its companions in the cedar box, ready to travel to the tapestry works where it will become part of something larger than itself. The spinner sets the bobbin down on the work table with a soft, decisive thud, the sound marking the end of the main work for the day, and she extinguishes the candle with a gentle puff, the smoke curling upward into the dusk-filled room, where the last light of the sun still lingers at the window like a guest reluctant to leave. The wheel stands silent. The silk tray is nearly empty, the gold leaf box is closed, and the workshop settles into the quiet of early evening, a quiet that is not the empty waiting of the pre-dawn darkness, but the contented rest of a space that has been filled with steady, patient labor, and now prepares to let that labor go. The bobbin rests on the work table, where the spinner set it down, its plump cylinder of gold thread catching the last faint glimmer of dusk that still seeps through the open shutter. A soft rose-grey light that is no longer strong enough to work by but still sufficient to see the shapes of things, the outlines of furniture, the pale blur of the spinner's hands as they move through the settling gloom. The great wheel stands motionless now, its hum departed, its spokes frozen in their last random position, and the treadle beneath the spinner's stool has fallen still, the leather drive band slack above it in a loose, relaxed curve. The workshop feels different in this hour, not empty but restful, a space that has completed its daily labor and now lingers in the quiet interval between work and night. The spinner does not light another candle immediately, but instead crosses to the shutter and stands before it for a moment, her silhouette dark against the fading sky, her hands resting on the wooden frame. Beyond the rooftops, the western sky holds a band of pale amber that is slowly cooling to grey, and a few early stars have begun to appear in the darker east, tiny points of light that are not yet bright enough to cast any glow. The air that comes through the open shutter is cooler than before, carrying the first hint of evening's freshness, the smell of stone cooling after the day's warmth, and the distant damp scent of the river beginning to stir again as the city settles toward night. The spinner breathes in this air once, deeply and slowly, and then pulls the shutter closed, the wooden panel swinging inward on its hinges with the same low groan it made when opened in the morning, sealing the workshop away from the outside world. With the shutter closed, the room sinks into a dim blue half-light, the only illumination coming from the high windows where the sky still glows faintly through the uneven glass, a soft, diffuse radiance that is just enough to navigate by. The spinner moves through this twilight with the confidence of long familiarity, her feet finding the path to the work table without searching, her hands reaching unerringly for the candle drawer, the flint and steel, the small charred cloth that serves as tinder. A few quick strikes produce a shower of sparks, one of which catches on the tinder and glows orange, and the spinner nurtures this ember with a gentle breath until a fresh candle wick dips into it and takes the flame, the new light springing up and pushing the darkness back to the corners where it settles like a quiet animal curling up to sleep. The candle is placed in its brass holder at the center of the work table, and now the spinner turns her full attention to the bobbin and its burden of gold thread. She lifts the bobbin from the spindle with both hands, cradling it as though it were a small, sleeping creature, and she carries it around to the far side of the work table, where a separate mechanism stands waiting, a device that has not been used all day, but now becomes the focus of the evening's final task. This is the hand-cranked winder, a simple apparatus of turned wood and iron that stands on a square base clamped to the edge of the table, its purpose to transfer thread from the working bobbins to the larger storage spools that will later be packed and sent to the tapestry works. The winder consists of a horizontal shaft fitted with a handle at one end and a series of adjustable pegs at the other, the pegs designed to hold the receiving spool firmly in place while the handle is turned. Beside it, mounted on a small wooden stand, a row of guide eyes directs the thread from the source bobbin to the destination spool, keeping the tension even and preventing any snarl or tangle during the transfer. The spinner sets the full bobbin onto a vertical pin at the start of the guide path and takes an empty storage spool from a shelf above the winder, a larger wooden cylinder with flared ends that will hold the entire length of the day's production in one neat, continuous winding. The empty spool is fitted onto the shaft of the winder with a firm press, the wood sliding into place and seating against the flange with a soft, definite click. The spinner then takes the loose end of the gold thread from the full bobbin and draws it carefully across the guide eyes, threading it through the first porcelain ring, then the second, then the third, each eye directing the thread at a slightly different angle so that the path from bobbin to spool is a smooth, unkinked line. The end is tucked into a slot on the empty spool and given a single turn around the core to secure it. And then the spinner settles herself on a stool beside the winder, her right hand taking hold of the crank handle while her left hand rests lightly on the guide path, ready to detect any irregularity in the thread's passage. The first turn of the crank produces a soft, measured click, the sound of a pawl engaging with a gear tooth inside the winder mechanism, a wooden tick that is entirely different from the hum of the spinning wheel. Lower in pitch and more regular in its spacing, a steady, clock-like beat that counts out the transfer of thread from bobbin to spool. The spinner turns the crank with a slow, consistent rhythm, her wrist rotating in a small circular motion that never varies its speed, and with each turn, the gold thread moves through the guide eyes and wraps itself around the storage spool in a neat, tight layer, the thread settling into place with a faint, silken whisper that is barely audible beneath the clicking of the pawl. You watch the transfer unfold from your bench in the corner, the candlelight illuminating the winder and the spinner's hands and the golden thread that travels between them, a bright shimmering line that seems to flow rather than move, a liquid thread of gold that passes from the small bobbin to the large spool with a smooth, hypnotic continuity. The smaller bobbin grows slowly lighter and more slender as its burden unwinds, the layers of gold thread peeling away one by one and revealing the darker core beneath, the bare wood that has been hidden since the early hours of the morning. The larger spool, meanwhile, fills at the same steady pace, its diameter increasing with each layer as the gold thread builds up into a dense, gleaming cylinder that looks identical to the one the bobbin held, but larger, more substantial, a repository of the entire day's patient labor. The clicking of the winder fills the workshop with its steady, unhurried rhythm, a sound that seems to measure time in a different way than the spinning wheel did, not the continuous hum of creation, but the discrete, countable beats of completion, each click marking another inch of thread safely transferred, another small portion of the day's work made ready for its journey. The spinner's hand turns the crank with the same calm, mechanical regularity that her foot pressed the treadle, her wrist never tiring, her pace never faltering, and the transfer continues through the candlelit evening, the golden thread flowing from one spool to the other like a quiet, domestic river moving between two still pools. After a span of time that can only be measured by the fullness of the spools, the smaller bobbin gives up its last coil of gold thread, the end slipping free from the core with a soft, almost reluctant release, and passing through the guide eyes to join its companions on the storage spool. The spinner turns the crank a few more times to be certain that the thread is fully transferred and that no loose end remains, and then she stops, her hand resting on the handle, the pawl falling silent. The full storage spool now sits on the winder shaft, its surface a dense, shining mass of gold, and the empty bobbin stands bare on its pin, its dark wood exposed and ready to be wound again tomorrow. The spinner removes the full spool from the shaft with a gentle pull and holds it up to the candle, turning it slowly so that the light travels across its surface, the gold gleaming with a soft, steady radiance that seems almost warm to the touch. She repeats the same inspection ritual that she performed on the working bobbin earlier, her eyes scanning the layers of thread for any gap or irregularity. But the transfer has introduced no flaws and the spool is perfect, its thread tight and even from end to end. The inspection complete, she sets the spool down on a clean square of linen cloth and reaches for the padded box that sits on a shelf behind the work table, a larger box than the cedar ones that hold the gold leaf, its interior lined with soft, undyed wool and divided into compartments that are sized exactly to hold the storage spools. The box is opened, and you see that it already contains several spools from previous days, each one a cylinder of golden thread identical to the one the spinner now places among them. The new spool fitting into its compartment with a snug, gentle pressure that holds it secure without crushing the thread. The spools gleam in the candlelight, a row of captured sunshine lying in their woolen nests, and the spinner pauses for a moment to look at them, her expression calm and unreadable, before closing the lid with a soft padded thud. This box is destined for the royal Tapestry works, where the gold thread will be woven into the great hangings that adorn the palaces and chapels of the kingdom. But here in the quiet workshop, the destination seems distant and abstract, a future that has no bearing on the peaceful stillness of the evening. With the thread safely stored, the spinner now turns to the small brass scale that sits on a shelf near the ledger, a delicate instrument with a balance beam and a set of worn lead weights that have been used for so many years that their surfaces are smooth and slightly concave where fingers have lifted them. She places the full storage spool on one pan of the scale and adds weights to the other pan one by one, the beam tipping and settling until it reaches a perfect, level equilibrium, the pointer aligned with its mark at the center of the arc. The spinner reads the weight from the stack of weights and gives a small nod, the result clearly within the expected range, and then she lifts the spool from the pan and returns the weights to their velvet-lined box. The ledger that sits on the shelf beside the scale is a thick, leather-bound volume with pages that have yellowed slightly at the edges, its spine cracked and softened from years of opening and closing. The spinner opens it to a page marked by a thin ribbon of faded silk and dips a quill into a small stoneware ink pot, the nib scratching softly against the paper as she writes the date, the weight of the spool, and a brief notation that might describe the quality of the thread or the number of spools produced, the handwriting small and neat and entirely without flourish. The ink is blotted with a scrap of linen, the quill is wiped clean and laid in a wooden rest, and the ledger is closed with the same quiet care with which it was opened, the ribbon falling back into place to mark the page for tomorrow. The evening's work is now done, and the spinner begins the final tidying of the workspace with the same slow, methodical attention she brought to every other task of the day. The empty bobbin is wiped clean of any residual gold dust and set in a tray with other empty bobbins that wait to be wound again, a row of bare wooden cores standing upright like small sentinels. The winder is wiped down with a dry cloth, its guide eyes checked for any accumulation of silk fibers, and a drop of oil is applied to the crank bearing where the wood has begun to warm from the friction of turning. The work table is cleared of the leather pad, the brush, the spatula, and the copper bowl, each tool returned to its proper place in the drawer or on the shelf, and the gold leaf that remains in the cedar box is counted with a quick, practiced glance before the lid is closed and the box returned to its row. The candle has burned down considerably during the transfer, and the tidying, its flame now low and slightly blue at the base, the wax pooling around the wick in a shallow, trembling lake. The spinner looks around the workshop one final time, her gaze passing over the silent spinning wheel, the closed shutter, the padded box of golden spools, the ledger on its shelf, and every surface is clean and ordered, every tool in its place, the room settled into a state of quiet readiness for the morning that will come. She lifts the candle holder and carries it toward the door, her footsteps slow and soft on the wide floorboards, and the light moves with her, leaving the corners of the workshop to sink back into the deep, peaceful darkness of the Lyon night. Night has fully settled over Lyon, the last trace of amber gone from the western sky, and the stars now bright and numerous above the rooftops, their light too distant to penetrate the closed shutter and the high windows of the workshop. Inside the room the darkness is complete and absolute, a soft, velvety black that presses gently against every surface, filling the corners where the candlelight once flickered and erasing the outlines of the spinning wheel, the work table, the stools, the shelves. The air is still and cool, the warmth of the day slowly dissipating through the stone walls, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent of old wood and beeswax, and the faint, lingering trace of cedar that rises from the closed boxes on their shelf. Nothing moves in the workshop, not a floorboard creaking, not a draught stirring the linen cloth on the table, not a spider crossing the whitewashed ceiling on its silent, nightly rounds. On the shelf behind the work table, the padded box sits exactly where the spinner left it, its lid closed, its wool-lined interior holding the storage spools in their separate compartments, each spool a dense cylinder of gold-wrapped silk that gleams unseen in the perfect darkness. The box itself is made of pale poplar wood, lighter than the cedar boxes that hold the gold leaf. Its surface is plain smooth and fitted with simple iron hinges that have been oiled to silence, and it rests on the shelf with the quiet solidity of an object that knows its place and its purpose. Inside the box, the darkness is even deeper than the darkness of the room, a concentrated, enclosed blackness that lies against the wool lining and wraps around each spool like a second, softer padding, and within this darkness the gold thread waits with a patience that is not human, a patience that belongs to metal and silk and wood, the patience of things that have no need to hurry. The thread itself does not stir, does not unwind, does not shift in its compartment, for the box is perfectly still, and the spools are fitted snugly against the wool, held in a gentle, even pressure that allows no movement. The gold leaf that spirals around each silk core holds its shape without relaxing. The microscopic moisture that helped it adhere in the morning, long since dried, the bond between silk and metal, now set and stable. If there were light to see by, the thread would gleam with a soft, quiet radiance, the overlapping layers of gold catching any illumination and returning it with a warmth that speaks of the sun that shone through the high windows during the long afternoon. But here in the dark there is no gleam, no radiance, only the silent, invisible presence of the gold resting in its woolen bed. The sounds of the night city filter into the workshop as faint, distant murmurs that are so muffled by the stone walls and the closed shutter that they seem to come from a world far away, a world that has nothing to do with the quiet room and its sleeping twos. A church bell marks the hour somewhere across the rooftops, its tone a low bronze note that rolls through the cold air and fades slowly, leaving a resonance that hangs in the silence for a long moment before dissolving. The bell does not disturb the thread or the box or the darkness. It simply passes through, a brief ripple in the ocean of the night, and then it is gone, and the silence flows back to fill the space it occupied. Later, after the bell has faded and the silence has restored itself, the slow clop of a horse's hooves sounds on the cobblestones of the street below, a single animal walking at a measured, weary pace, its iron shoes striking the stone with a regular, hollow rhythm that approaches from a distance, passes directly beneath the shuttered window, and then continues on, growing fainter and fainter until it is absorbed into the general murmur of the city. The horse does not know that the gold thread waits above it, and the thread does not know that the horse passes below, the two existences touching only through the vibration that travels up the stone wall and fades before it can reach the shelf. A vibration so faint that even the most sensitive instrument could barely register it. Beyond the street, the river Somme continues its own quiet journey through the heart of Lyon, its waters moving with a slow, steady current that has flowed for thousands of years and will flow for thousands more, a murmur so constant that the city has ceased to hear it, a sound that has become the baseline of silence itself. The river carries the reflections of the stars on its dark surface, the pinpoints of light broken and scattered by the gentle ripples, and the sound of the water passing over the stones at the river's edge is a soft, continuous hush that reaches the workshop as a presence felt more than heard, a low, subaudible hum that underpins the deeper silence of the night. The padded box on the shelf waits through the bells and the hoofbeats and the river's murmur, and as the night deepens toward its stillest hour, the imagination of the workshop begins to drift toward the morning that will come, the journey that the box will undertake when the sun rises and the city wakes. This journey is not a drama, but a sequence of quiet, predictable transfers, each step so ordinary and so familiar that it barely merits description. A chain of gentle handovers that will carry the gold thread from the workshop to the tapestry works without haste or incident. The box will be lifted from its shelf by the spinner's calm hands and carried to the door, where a courier will wait with a leather satchel lined with more wool, the box fitting inside the satchel with the same snug security with which the spools fit inside the box. The courier will walk along the familiar streets of Lyon, his route so well worn that his feet find the way without his mind attending to it, past the bakers' ovens that will already be sending the smell of bread into the morning air, past the fountain at the corner of the square where water trickles from a stone lion's mouth into a mossy basin, past the church where the same bell that marked the night hours will soon mark the hour of terce with its slow bronze voice. The courier will arrive at the coach station, a modest yard with a cobblestone floor and a wooden shelter where passengers and parcels gather in the early light, and he will hand the satchel to the coachman with a brief word and a nod, the exchange taking only a moment before the satchel is stowed in the luggage compartment at the rear of the coach, a compartment lined with canvas and secured by a leather strap that buckles across its front. The coach will depart Lyon by the northern road, its wheels turning on the packed earth and gravel with a steady, grinding rumble that will carry the gold thread through the countryside, past fields of wheat stubble and vineyards where the grapes are just beginning to swell on the vines, past small villages where dogs sleep in the doorways and the smoke from morning fires rises straight into the still air. The journey will take the better part of a day, the coach stopping once at a posting inn where the horses will be changed, and the coachman will take a cup of wine and a heel of bread, while the satchel remains in the luggage compartment, undisturbed and unopened. The new horses will be fresh and eager, their hooves striking the road with a faster rhythm than those they replaced, and the coach will continue north through the afternoon, the sun crossing the sky above it in its own steady journey, the shadows of the roadside trees falling across the canvas cover and sliding away again as the wheels turn. When the coach arrives at the Tapestry works, a large stone building set among formal gardens on the outskirts of a town whose name is not important, the satchel will be taken down from the luggage compartment by a porter and carried through a wide doorway into a receiving room where other boxes and parcels wait on long wooden tables, each one labelled and logged in a ledger much like the one that sits on the shelf in the Lyon workshop. The box that contains the gold thread will be opened by a different pair of hands, a supervisor who will lift each spool from its woolen compartment and examine it under a bright window light, turning it slowly to check the quality of the thread, the evenness of the gold, the tightness of the winding, just as the spinner examined it by candlelight in the evening. The supervisor will weigh the spool on a larger scale that stands in the corner of the receiving room, a scale of polished brass with weights that are stamped with the royal mark, and the weight will be recorded in a second ledger that tracks every spool that enters the tapestry, works every length of gold thread that will be woven into the great designs that are slowly taking shape on the looms in the hall beyond. The spools will then be carried to a storage room where hundreds of similar spools wait in ordered rows on floor-to-ceiling shelving, a library of gold thread that holds the accumulated labor of many workshops and many spinners. And the thread that was spun in the quiet room in Lyon will take its place among them, indistinguishable from its companions, ready to be called upon when the weavers need it. All of this lies in the future, a future that is as calm and as predictable as the past from which the thread has come. And for now, none of it has happened, none of it is happening, none of it needs to happen yet. The padded box sits on its shelf in the dark workshop, and the thread sleeps inside it, and the night holds everything in a deep, peaceful suspension that asks for nothing, expects nothing, hurries toward nothing. The church bell will ring again, the river will continue to murmur, the stars will wheel slowly overhead, and the box will wait, patient and still, for the first grey light of dawn to touch the high windows and announce the beginning of another quiet day. The workshop stands in complete darkness now, the last candle long since extinguished and the shutter closed tight against the night, the high windows showing nothing but the deep soft black of a sky without moon. The spinning wheel is a silhouette among silhouettes, its great wheel motionless, its spokes dividing the darkness into invisible segments that no eye can trace, its treadle still and flat against the floorboards where the spinner's foot pressed and released through all the long hours of the day. The work table stands empty and clean, its linen cloth a pale ghost in the blackness, the guide pegs rising from it like two small sentinels guarding nothing, the copper bowl dry and upturned beside the row of cedar boxes that hold what remains of the gold leaf. Every tool is in its place, every surface wiped and ordered, and the air holds the quiet contentment of a room that has done its work and now rests. The padded box on its shelf behind the work table contains the storage spools with their dense, perfect windings of gold-wrapped silk, the thread invisible in the dark, but present, nevertheless, a quiet, gathered light that waits without impatience. The wool lining of the box cradles each spool with a soft, even pressure, and the poplar lid fits snug over them, a simple wooden shield against the dust that might settle overnight, though no dust stirs in the still air. The ledger beside the box is closed, its leather cover smooth and cool, the ribbon marking the page where the spinner recorded the weight of the spool, the date, the brief notation that will recall this day when it is opened again in the morning. The quill rests in its wooden stand, the ink in the stoneware pot has settled and stilled, and the small brass scale stands with its pans empty and balanced, the pointer centered exactly on its mark. Outside the workshop the street is empty and silent, the cobblestones glistening faintly with the dew that has begun to form as the night air cools, the moisture beading on the stones and reflecting the starlight in tiny scattered points that are too dim to see. The stone buildings of Lyon rise on either side of the narrow street, their facades dark and shuttered, their occupants long since retired to their beds, and the only movement in the street is the slow drift of a tabby cat that picks its way along the gutter, its paws silent on the stone, its tail held low and still, its eyes catching the starlight with a brief green flash before it slips around a corner and vanishes. The cat does not know about the gold thread, and the gold thread does not know about the cat, the two lives brushing past each other in the night without contact, without consequence, each absorbed in its own quiet existence. Above the rooftops, the sky has deepened to a rich, velvety indigo. The stars now fully emerged and shining with a cold, steady light that has traveled for unimaginable years to reach this particular night over this particular city. The constellations turn slowly overhead in their ancient silent dance, the Great Bear swinging around the pole star by a degree that no eye can measure, the Pleiades glimmering in their tight cluster like a handful of diamond dust scattered on dark velvet. The moon, a slim crescent of pale silver, has risen late and now hangs low in the eastern sky, its light too faint to cast shadows, but strong enough to touch the edges of the rooftops and the rims of the chimney pots with a soft, ghostly glow. This moonlow slips through a gap in the high window, where the shutter does not quite meet the frame, a sliver of silver light that enters the workshop and falls across the floor in a thin, straight line, the only illumination in the entire room. The moonbeam moves across the floorboards with an imperceptible slowness, its pace governed by the rotation of the earth and the arc of the moon, a motion so gradual that it would take an hour to advance the width of a hand. It touches the edge of the spinning wheel's shadow and passes over it, the dark circle of the great wheel momentarily outlined in silver before the beam moves on, reaching toward the work table, crawling across the wide planks with the steady, patient progress of water seeping through sand. The dust that the spinner swept into the clay jar earlier has settled, the smallest particles still suspended in the air like a fine invisible mist, and when the moonbeam passes through them, they glimmer for a moment, a tiny constellation of indoor stars that appears and fades as the light moves on. The moonbeam reaches the work table and climbs its leg, the silver light creeping up the turned wood and spreading across the surface of the linen cloth, where it reveals the faintest traces of gold dust that the spinner's wiping could not entirely remove, a dusting of pale metallic shimmer that glows softly in the moonlight like the memory of the day's labor. The beam touches the row of cedar boxes, and their pale wood gleams for a moment, the grain of the cedar visible as faint, dark lines that run parallel to the edges of each lid, and then the beam moves past them and reaches the padded box on the shelf, the box that holds the golden spools, the box that will travel in the morning to the coach station, and then onto the tapestry works. The moonbeam rests upon the closed lid of the padded box with a gentle silver pressure, and the poplar wood, which has been dark all night, now shows its pale, even color, the small iron hinges catching the light and glinting like tiny mirrors. Inside the box the thread does not stir, does not know that the moonlight has found it, does not respond to the celestial attention, but the box itself seems to glow faintly, a soft, luminous rectangle on the dark shelf, a small beacon of quiet promise in the sleeping workshop. The moonbeam will stay there for perhaps half an hour, perhaps longer, before the moon continues its arc, and the beam moves on to touch the ledger and the scale and the quill. And then it will climb the wall and fade as the window frame cuts off the light, returning the workshop to complete darkness once more. Beyond the workshop, beyond the street, beyond the rooftops, the entire city of Lyon lies under the same indigo sky, its buildings and bridges and squares all sleeping in the deep stillness of the night. The river Soho murmurs its endless, quiet song as it flows between its stone banks, the water dark and smooth except where the starlight catches the ripples and breaks them into fleeting silver threads. Threads that are not gold, but that shine in the darkness with their own quiet beauty. The bridges that span the river are empty, their arches casting black shadows on the water, and the boats that are moored along the quay rock gently with the current, their ropes creaking with a soft, rhythmic sound that is too faint to reach the workshop. The great Cathedral of Saint-Jean stands at the heart of the city, its twin towers rising against the stars, its bells silent now after marking the hours of the night, its interior a vast cold darkness where the only light is the red flicker of the sanctuary lamp, a tiny flame that has burned without interruption for centuries. The spinner who worked all day in the quiet workshop is now at home, wherever that home may be, sleeping in a narrow bed beneath a sloping ceiling, her hands still and relaxed on the coverlet, her breathing deep and even. The day's labor has left no mark on her, beyond the pleasant tiredness that comes from steady, focused work, and her dreams, if she dreams at all, are not of gold leaf or silk filament or spinning wheels, but of simple, ordinary things, a garden, a meal, the sound of someone she knows speaking in a low, calm voice. The courier who will carry the padded box in the morning is also sleeping, his satchel hanging on a hook by his door, his coat brushed and ready, his route already fixed in his mind so deeply that he could walk it in his sleep. The coachman who will drive the coach northward sleeps in a room above the station stables, the smell of hay and horses rising through the floorboards, his whip and his gloves laid on a chair beside his bed. All of them are resting, all of them are part of the same quiet chain that connects the workshop to the tapestry works, and for now all of them are still, suspended in the deep, silent interval between one day and the next. The workshop itself seems to breathe in the darkness, the wooden beams overhead settling with tiny, sporadic ticks as the night coolness contracts the timber, the stone walls releasing the last of the day's stored warmth in a slow, invisible exhalation. The smells of the room have blended together into a single harmonious fragrance that is part beeswax, part cedar, part old wood and worn leather. A smell that is the signature of the workshop, the olfactory record of decades of patient, repetitive work. The silence is not empty, but full, layered with the memory of the spinning wheel's hum, and the treadles creak, and the brushes whisper, and the winders click, sounds that have soaked into the walls and the floor and the very air, sounds that will rise again when the morning comes and the spinner returns. The moonbeam slides slowly off the padded box and continues its journey across the shelf, touching the spine of the ledger and the brass scale and the pottery jar of brushes, each object receiving its brief moment of silver illumination before returning to the dark. The moon itself climbs higher and grows a little brighter as the night progresses, its crescent thinning toward the new moon that will arrive in a few days, and the starlight shifts imperceptibly as the constellations wheel on their vast, silent paths. The tabby cat returns along the gutter and disappears into a different alley. The river continues its flow, the sanctuary lamp continues its red flicker in the dark cathedral, and the gold thread continues its patient sleep inside the padded box, wrapped in wool and poplar and night, waiting for the first grey light of dawn to touch the high windows and announce the beginning of another quiet, ordinary, peaceful day in the long, slow history of the workshop in Lyon.